Hello, this is Howard Owens, publisher of the Batavian. We're doing another interview, this time with GOP primary candidate Stefan Mychajliw. So, Stefan, thank you for joining us today.
No, I greatly appreciate the time. Thank you.
Okay. So, as I mentioned, I'm going to start out with some general questions about, kind of what your conceptions are of our form of government. So, first question I want to ask you is, do you believe the following statement to be true? All people are created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights, including the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Well, it's certainly the foundation of our government via our founding fathers, and I would strongly agree with that when it comes to what you just shared. When it comes to the Constitution, I mean, obviously, and especially as it pertains to the Second Amendment, I'm a firm believer of that. And yes, I would agree with that statement.
Do you believe the government exists primarily to secure those rights?
I think it all depends on the rights that you discuss. Being extremely pro-life and very strongly, pro-life, I believe that government's role is to protect the lives of the unborn and the born. And so when it comes to that, I would say that government has a role in protecting the lives of the unborn, because that's when I believe life begins.
Do you believe the framers of the Constitution intended to create a federal government as opposed to a national government, and that the authority not granted explicitly to the federal government belongs to the authorities? The authority belongs to the states or the individual?
Looking at a 30,000-foot view, I firmly believe that those at the local level have more knowledge and insight on how to control their governments and what's best for their respective areas, rather than some bureaucrat in Washington. So my bigger picture view of that is that, yes, of course, there is a somewhat limited role for the federal government when it comes to decision making for our country. But I would strongly defer to those at the local level when it comes to the decision making process and what's best for their area. What works in New York State may not work for somewhere in the South, whether it's in North Carolina, South Carolina, or somewhere out west. So, bigger picture decision making, I would most certainly defer and grant more authority to the power of states and localities rather than the big bureaucracy and federal government. I mean, look, when you go back to I just use it as an example, the Cash for Clunkers program many years ago, they basically ran out of money a few days after starting it. So if the federal government can't successfully run a used car sale, I would rather trust those at the local government rather than the federal level.
Do you believe the framers intended that Congress have greater authority under Article 1 than the executive branch under Article 2?
Well, look, I think their system of checks and balances was incredible in the force that they had, obviously hundreds of years ago. It's working now, and it's the reason why we have the greatest democracy in the world. I mean, I know here at the local level the importance of checks and balances. I'm the taxpayer's watchdog. I'm the county controller. I'm the one that has that watchdog authority and oversight over the legislative branch and the executive branch. And so a lot of people complain about that balance of power, and they say that Washington moves at a grinding halt and it's slow, but checks and balances are incredibly important. I mean, I'll give you the example when it comes to tariffs. I believe it's Article 8 where Congress has the authority to excise taxes and tariffs and not the President of the United States. That's a good thing, those checks and balances giving Congress authority in that respect. So I do not believe when it comes to having an extremely strong executive branch, I think the framers were geniuses, and their insight, goes to show that we have the strongest democracy many, many years later because of those checks and balances, that there are strong checks and balances between Congress, the executive branch, and obviously the judicial.
It's interesting you bring up tariffs. I think a lot of people don't realize what the Constitution says about tariffs. And of course, Congress ceding a lot of that authority to the executive over the years goes back decades, pre-Trump. But we now have a president who approaches trade as if he has all the authority. Do you think he's exceeding his authority?
Well, I believe, going back to Richard Nixon, and you mentioned very correctly when it comes to the executive branch exerting what they believe is their authority over tariffs and taxes, using, whether it's wartime powers or things like that to enact tariffs on their own. And I'm a firm believer that we go to the Constitution. Again, I'm pretty sure it's Article 8 that says Congress has the authority when it comes to tariffs and taxes. Now, I believe the president, whether it's Donald Trump or anyone else, should work with Congress when it comes to enacting tariffs. But my belief on tariffs is a tariff is a tax. 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 And I understand the executive branch in smaller cases wanting to use a tariff as a carrot and a stick approach when it comes to trying to negotiate legislation. But at the end of the day, the Constitution's clear. Congress has that authority and not the president of the United States, no matter who's sitting in the Oval Office.
So back to inalienable rights, and you kind of touched on this already, but so if all people have inalienable rights, and it's attached to the person, at what point does a human being become a person endowed with those rights?
I believe it's at conception. I believe that's where life begins. And I share with you my thoughts of government when it comes to protecting the lives of people, people that are born in the United States of America. I firmly believe that life begins at conception, and I think it's government's role to protect that life, whether it's in the womb or whether it's, a walking, living human being. And so that's why I feel very strongly that, I've always been pro-life. I've been consistent in that conservative belief. And I feel as though, even though my bigger picture view of government is that we should have a limited federal government, we do need a government, whether it's the local level, federal level. Here, in Erie County, we maintain roads, we maintain our libraries, our parks. But going back to that bigger belief that I have, government also enacts laws to protect its citizens.
Going back to John Locke's conception, which is a big influence on our founders, that rights are natural and flow from our personhood, our property, our talents, our skills, what we can do with our mind, our free speech. You believe that at conception, an embryo is capable of forming thoughts and exercising rights that are natural and therefore inalienable at that point?
Yeah, look, it's very simple for me. Life begins at conception, and government does have a role in protecting life at all costs. And I believe it begins at conception. When it comes to conception, is that living, growing entity, can it think and speak like you and I? No. And that's why, when it comes to my faith and being pro-life, I think that those of us that have a conscience and have thoughts and have a moral guide, that we should protect those lives in the womb, which begins at conception. So yes, I firmly believe that's where life begins, and I think government has a role, a limited one, that we should protect it. And that's exactly why I am pro-life, and that's my view of government and its protection of it.
Do you think that abortion is an issue that should be a states' rights issue?
It's been a state and federal issue ever since Roe versus Wade. I mean, I would support an amendment to the Constitution that bans abortion and protects life. As I shared with you before, a lot of the decision-making process when it comes to states are made at that level. But I would support, whether it's a state or local decision or a federal decision, any legislation that protects the life of the unborn, period. Whether that's the Supreme Court, whether it's the federal government, or whether it's at the state level.
The Declaration of Independence not just talks about rights, but it also talks about the role of government, looking out for the people's safety and happiness, looking out for the public good. The preamble of the Constitution talks about government, securing the general welfare of the public. What role do you see for government in ensuring the health, safety, and well-being of every American?
I think government should have a limited role, that people in the free market have the best drivers and best decisions of what's best for them. I am a firm believer in individual rights and capitalism in the free market, that those drivers and those decisions are much better than bureaucrats in Washington or the federal government. So I firmly believe that less involvement, especially when it comes to the economic markets and especially in some respects our lives, that the federal government should butt out and let the free market, let individuals decide.
A big issue right now is still health care. What's your plan for ensuring that every American receives access to health care?
Well, look, there's the free market when it comes to healthcare. I look at government healthcare in my role as controller, and it's an absolute disaster. Obamacare is a disaster. I see it every day as the fiscal watchdog here in Erie County. In theory, it sounds wonderful. Let's give everyone health care coverage and let the taxpayers and the government pay for it. But in principle, when it's actually put in place, it's been an absolute train wreck. For example, here in Erie County, anyone can go to ECMC and receive health care, regardless of whether or not they can pay. So in essence, any taxpayer in Erie County has health care if they go to our county hospital, whether they pay or not. The amount of budget that Erie County controls is about $150 million. And under Obamacare, that we cover the losses for our county hospital, that bill last year alone was $75 million. So in theory, yes, it sounds wonderful. Let's provide health care for everyone. But at the end of the day, you have to ask, can a combination of the free market and capitalism and private health care combined with some government combined health care, is it affordable and is it sustainable? And I would say the answer is no. Is our healthcare system perfect? No. But I do believe that individuals should go to the free market if they can and make decisions on their healthcare based on their doctor. The last thing I would want to see is a national socialized healthcare system where I'm calling some bureaucrat in Washington, a pencil-pushing insurance person, and letting them decide what my health care should be based on socialized medicine. So I firmly believe that, sure, we can improve the current healthcare system that we have. It's not perfect, but I think it's a hell of a lot better than letting someone in government run the United States healthcare system. And I used that example before. The Cash for Clunkers program ran out of money, and the government could not even run successfully a used car sale. I don't want those same people being in charge of our healthcare.
Do you think that income or wealth inequality should be an issue that is it an issue, and is it an issue conservatives should be concerned about?
I think it's an issue on what people can earn. I go to my family story that my grandparents were humble farmers in Ukraine. They fled during World War II, and my family eventually came to America in 1965 with practically nothing in their pockets. They had just enough to buy the house that we lived in. My dad was a typewriter repairman. My mom was a factory worker. And they instilled in yours truly and my six siblings that through God's grace, hard work, and a great education, you can be and do anything you want in the United States of America. Government has nothing to do with it. And we grew up extremely poor. We grew up on public assistance, and a lot of times the only meal that I got was eating breakfast or lunch at school. And I paid my own way through college. I worked loading trucks. I'm going to date myself a little bit, but the old Super Duper Jubilee, I loaded trucks and stocked shelves overnight, and then I worked a construction job during the day to pay my own way through school. So I firmly believe in the free market and capitalism and someone's own hard work rather than government when it comes to income inequality. If you're not happy with your income, work harder or find out a way to earn more. And I'll close by using the example of my older brother. He was a Buffalo firefighter. At the time, no college degree, 3 kids, mortgage, just like a lot of people. And he decided one day to become a surgeon. So he made the choice to work hard, go to med school, get his undergraduate degree. Now he's a highly successful orthopedic surgeon. And only in America could the sons of immigrants achieve the American dream and live that goal. And that's all because of hard work in the free market, not government.
What's the phrase, make America great again, mean to you?
If you go back in political history, that phrase was uttered by Ronald Reagan and then adopted by Donald Trump in 2016, who I actually worked and volunteered for on his campaign in 2016 at the Republican National Convention. And I was a Trump surrogate doing a lot of media interviews back then. But making America great again, I believe it's a philosophy, a conservative one that goes back to Ronald Reagan and now adopted by Donald Trump. That when it comes to our foreign policy and even our domestic policy, that we should put America first and improve our country based on what it was when Barack Obama was president of the United States. For me, make America great again or keep America great is basically the life that I live. You know, I share that story of my family being Ukrainian and Polish immigrants coming here with nothing, and that I've been able to build an amazing, incredible life as a husband and father of three in public service because we live in the greatest country in the world. So making America great again or keep America great, as is the slogan for 2020, I think is the backbone of a conservative philosophy of less government, lower taxes, putting more money back into the pockets of income generators, which is businesses and people, and out of the hands of big government.
So my next question kind of is related to your previous answer where you mentioned a relative who was a postal carrier and lived the American dream and became a surgeon, highly successful surgeon. And, you know, prior to 2016, Americans enjoyed perhaps the greatest standard of living in history. Unemployment was under 5%, which by historical standards, you know, is still very low, and it was falling. People were enjoying greater choice in consumer goods, expanding upper middle class, low inflation, greater freedom of movement than any time in this history, greater individual liberty at any time in this history. So why wasn't America already great?
I think going back to the founding of our great nation, we've always been the greatest and always will be. You know, have there been some ebbs and flows when it comes to whoever's in the White House and leading our country or in Congress about tough times? Sure. But I'll go back to when our middle child, Maxim Roman, was born and the tax cuts of the Trump economy. I check payroll religiously every other Friday because being the controller, I want to make sure there's enough in the county coffers to make sure that all of our people are paid. If not, they'd come to my office with a battering ram on fire. But it was a Friday when Maxim Roman was born, and that was when a lot of the Trump tax cuts kicked in. And I even looked at my personal paycheck, and there was a lot more in it from the previous period before, prior to when the Trump tax cuts kicked in. And I turned to my wife, again, right after our son was born, I said, hey, here's the extra money that we have in our paycheck, something tangible because of Donald Trump's tax cuts. And I started doing the math as a new dad again with a baby in diapers. I thought, okay, we can buy X amount of diapers per week, X amount of formula per week. We can spend that money or sock it away, in which we wound up doing is putting it in a 529 account for our son. But I don't think anyone could disagree with the statement that prior to the coronavirus pandemic, Donald Trump got this economy moving again like no other president in history. I mean, again, look at everyone's 401ks prior to the coronavirus pandemic. I mean, this economy was roaring with Donald Trump as president. And I don't think anyone would disagree with the fact that their 401ks and their personal wealth and lowering corporate taxes, that a lot of that money was delivered right back into the economy, delivered right back to workers in the form of bonuses. And so I firmly believe that Donald Trump was a far better president than his predecessors when it comes to the handling of the economy. Again, of course, we live in a different world because of COVID-19.
This kind of goes back to the Article 1, Article 2 question. You know, the president has in the past said it's the decision of the president, not the governors, to open up the states, that he would override governors, and that Article 2 gives him all of the authority. Just in the last day or two, he's threatened to overrule Congress on the 230 exemption for internet companies, and he's also threatened to send the National Guard into Minnesota. As a member of Congress, what would you do to check the president's unconstitutional claims of power?
Well, again, I go back to tariffs and making sure that's an issue that is very dear to my heart because, again, I firmly believe that a tariff is a tax. And regardless of who is in the White House, whether it's Donald Trump or anyone else, as a member of Congress, we need to honor our Constitution and the checks and balances that have been put in place and used for many years. Going back to your example, though, when it comes to opening states and the power of the executive branch and the power of states and running their respective governments. I mean, look at the state of Florida. They did it right when it comes to protecting its citizens from coronavirus. It's my understanding, just from what I read, that they were very proactive in protecting nursing homes and locking them down and locking down the elderly, but for the most part, putting in reasonable restrictions that kept their economy open. I believe the exact opposite was done in New York State. We have an executive branch in New York State that sent 6 seniors with coronavirus back into nursing homes. They've crippled our economy. They've shut down the entire economy. And I think you can have a balance of protecting people during this coronavirus crisis and keeping the economy going. And as Erie County Controller, we're facing a potential deficit of $170 to $200 million. Yet the budget that we control is about $150 million. And so I think maybe there can be stronger executive branch balance when it comes to keeping an eye on governors during the coronavirus crisis. But as a member of Congress, we're guided by the Constitution, regardless of who is the occupant of the White House.
So to come back to the Section 230 issue, I mean, that's a law passed by Congress, and Trump has signed an executive order trying to amend or change that law. Do you think he has that authority?
Well, I'm dealing with it right now here at the county level when it comes to executive orders. For example, according to our county charter, I declared a deficit saying that Erie County is facing massive losses. I've declared a deficit, and according to our charter, the county executive then has 7 days to come up with a deficit reduction plan. I have 7 days to come up with a deficit reduction plan in 7 days, and the legislature then has a few weeks to act in that respect. Our county executive then issued an emergency order, ignoring the charter, ignoring the laws of our land, saying, well, we get to ignore everything. I'm putting in this emergency order, and then I'm ignoring the laws of the land and instituting my own deadline of when I want to address the deficit. And I think that's wrong. So as that, my personal experience with executive orders and emergency orders as it goes into the federal government and potentially as a member of Congress, again, I'm speaking from a 30,000-foot view here. The checks and balances are put in place for a reason when it comes to having too much power in the executive branch or in the legislative branch for that respect. So when it comes to individual decisions of presidential executive orders and being a potential member of Congress, I think I would take it on a case-by-case basis and see whether or not, okay, is this best for the United States of America? But fight like hell to make sure that we maintain the balance of power and the checks and balances when it comes to being a member of Congress and honoring and abiding by the law set forth in the Constitution.
What do you think of Twitter fact-checking the president?
I think it's a joke. I do believe there is a liberal bias in national media. I'm not saying that takes place at the local level. And me being a former investigative journalist for almost 20 years, I have the deepest respect in the world for journalists. I think what you folks do at your newspaper is incredibly important for a community, your community, not only being a check and balance of government, but also to providing news of what's happening in your community. So I do have the deepest respect for journalists and for media, and that we always have to have a respect for the fourth branch of government. Democracy does not exist without folks like you, journalists and local newspapers and folks living their fourth branch of government, holding government accountable. But when it comes to social media, that's an entirely different animal. And I do believe that Twitter, Facebook, and other social media does have a bias against conservatives, and they do have a strong bias against the president of the United States. But at the end of the day, I don't think it matters what Twitter does or doesn't do against President Trump. Some way, somehow, he's going to get his message out to conservatives, whether it's through Twitter, social media, his email list, however he chooses to do it. It's their sandbox. They make the rules. But at the end of the day, I think the president's going to get his message out no matter what, and he'll be reelected in 2020.
Great. A last written question. There may be additional follow-ups, but if elected, the first big challenge he's going to face is restoring the economy. What's your economic plan?
I think we need to have a plan where we actually put money back into the private sector when it comes to a second round of tax cuts. You saw firsthand when President Trump cut the tax rates for the private sector and for companies. That money flowed back into employees, whether it's through bonuses or put back into the economy. I think a second round of tax cuts, whether it's a payroll tax cut or more tax cuts when it comes to corporations or individuals. I firmly believe that people in the private sector and the free market manage their money better than the federal government. So I think the first thing to do is another massive round of tax cuts. But, I saw the dark days of the red-green budget crisis here in Erie County back in 2005 and 2006. And I commend the government back then for cutting property taxes by 30%. But they did not have corresponding spending decreases to not only offset that, but to make sure they had a balanced budget. So while there is, and I would strongly support a second round of tax cuts, I think Washington needs to go on a debt diet. And the trillions that we're now spending on coronavirus bills and coronavirus relief, I mean, it's a good thing. The PPP program is actually putting money back into the hands of businesses and making sure that our economy does not collapse, even though we're looking at record unemployment and the crashing of our economy. I think we need to have a second round of tax cuts, but I also think we have to address the deficit, which is $20 trillion plus. And I think of my 3 kids and my grandchildren. I don't want them saddled with that debt, but I also think Congress needs to be responsible. If they're going to have a second round of tax cuts, they need to cut spending as well. And they can't spend like drunken sailors, because then that defeats the entire purpose of a round of tax cuts, that you're just going to have increased deficits if they cut taxes and not cut spending in a corresponding.
Going back to our previous discussion on tariffs and tariffs or taxes, would you stand up on the floor of Congress and call on, as part of a stimulus plan for the economy, call on the president to lift tariffs?
Well, look, again, my fundamental belief is that a tariff is a tax. And I understand the argument of President Trump when it comes to putting tariffs on certain countries that he wants to use as an incentive to bring them to the table for more fair trade practices. But I'll leave you NY-27 as an example of how tariffs hurt local companies. Ford Gum makes Big League Chew. They're in Akron, New York. And obviously sugar is the main portion of their product. And, when it comes to tariffs, we think, sure, let's hurt foreign companies or foreign countries when it comes to those tariffs. But at the end of the day, more often than not, you're actually hurting local companies. And, sugar tariffs hurt a company like that, Ford Gum, that makes Big League Chew, where the cost of their product, and I believe they're the only American-made gum manufacturer still in the United States, even though obviously there's companies here like Wrigley and others that produce gum. But they actually make it right in Akron, New York, and tariffs hurt American companies. And so, look, again, I believe it's Article 8 of the Constitution when it comes to what we discussed before about Congress having the authority to do that. And at the end of the day, Congress does, even though, again, the president does have, and I believe in wartime, and they can make the argument of extreme circumstances imposing tariffs. That duty rests, tariffs and taxes, solely with Congress, not the President of the United States, again, regardless of who's in that office.
Great. Well, thank you, Stefan. It's been great talking with you. I appreciate your time, and good luck in the campaign. And hopefully before too long, we're all going to be out in public and I'll get a chance to meet you in person.
All right. Sounds good. Thank you.